This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, New York Times reporter Adam Nagourney discusses his book, The Times. He looks at the successes and failures of the last 4 decades of the paper of record, the New York Times. He's interviewed by Columbia Journalism Review contributor Jon Allsop.
Adam, I'm sure if you asked most people to write a book on their place of work, they would rather do just about anything else. So what induced you to want to write a book about the Times?
Good question. First, thanks for having me on the show. I have always admired and wanted to work for the New York Times since I was a student in college. And one of the books I read as a college student, I think, or pretty early on, was Gay Talese's book of the Times. And it's something that I'd always thought about. The important, you raise a really good point in your question. I'm writing a history. So basically this book goes from 1977 through 2016. There are a bunch of advantages of that. For one thing, I'm not, for the most part, writing about people who are there, or to put it more directly, writing for people I work with or about. Few exceptions, but generally that's really the case. But more than that, in terms of approaching a project like this, there was a level of candor from the people that I was speaking to, because they were gone, and also access to documents that I don't think I would have if I was writing about the present. If I was writing a contemporaneous book about the Times, I don't see a way to do it while I was still working there. And I don't think I would want to do it, actually. I'm finding, as much as I expected, and maybe more so, that the benefit of time has really been critical in terms of assessing what is important, what matters, what doesn't, but also getting to the behind-the-scenes story of what was going on over these past 30, 40 years.
Yeah. Obviously, you mentioned that it's a history and mostly doesn't concern people who are still at the paper and therefore your colleagues. But you are, of course, a Times insider. You do work there.
Right.
Do you think that was a net advantage for you writing the book? Do you think in some ways you might have had an easier time if you were approaching it from the vantage point of an outside reporter or researcher? How do you sort of weigh the advantages and disadvantages of that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There are advantages in terms of knowing the people from the inside, having a sense of the culture. It's probably easier to get telephone calls returned. I think it helps that I haven't worked in the main office since, 2002. I could see advantages of both sides. I think if you're coming from the outside, it might be harder to get the cooperation I got. So when I first started this project, or first thought of it, the first thing I did was go to the publisher at the time, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., and asked if he would talk to me, cooperate on a book like this. And I think he said, let me think about it. I think he got back to me in about a month. And what he said to me was, I have decided that I will cooperate with you. I will sit down and give you all the time you want and do the best I can with my memory and reconstructing the important events of these past decades. He said, but I'm not going to tell anyone else what to do. This is not an official Times book. You're on your own. I don't expect everyone will talk to you. So, but what I learned, and John, what I should have probably realized at the time is that once the publisher agreed to talk to me, pretty much everyone else did, right? Because they, whether it was implicit or explicit, they wanted to be part of the project, tell their story, and, I don't mean to sound, starry-eyed, but make sure the book was as complete and as good as possible. I'd like to think that. So as a result, pretty much everyone I wanted to talk to sat down, talked to me, and shared documents. Now, would that have happened if I were an outsider? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, Gay Talese, when he did his book back in '69, he had been at the paper for a bunch of years, and he left the paper afterwards. So he did it. That's the way he did it. He was already gone. He had a foot in both camps that way.
Yeah. You mentioned the Gay Talese book as an inspiration for you. I guess one thing I was curious about reading it is the time span that you cover in the book. Starts more or less in 1976 with the elevation of Abe Rosenthal to executive editor, and ends more or less in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. You sort of mentioned, I guess, why it finishes when it does. You wanted to make this a history and not too much about current events, I guess. But why did you sort of choose that aperture on the whole? Why does it start in 1976 specifically? I mean, Abe Rosenthal had already been in charge of the paper at that point for a number of years, unless I'm mistaken, albeit
no,
not.
You're
with
right.
The
I'm sorry. He had been managing editor. A couple of reasons. I wanted a manageable time frame. Gates Leach's book ended in, I'm sorry for not remembering, I think it was 69, so I could have started in 69. A lot of that stuff had been written about already, Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, so it just seemed like a convenient bookend to start the book. But that's a fair question. That's one I could talk about forever. I could argue it both ways. The end of it, I think, was much clearer and much firm when to end it. So, but there was so much material. At some point, I just had to sort of package it the way I could package it, so it was accessible and had a clear narrative and narrative arc.
Yeah.
One thing I should say, I don't mean to jump ahead here. When I started this book, because you just made me think of it, I did not know how it would end. So remember, this is 2016 when I'm going around to various publishers, and the newspaper industry was really in major distress, and the Times was not doing well. So as it turned out, there was a clean ending to this book, to the point that the paper made, I argue in this book, the sort of adjustment from being a subscription-based, advertising-based model to a subscription-based model. So, but I cannot tell you that when I started this off, I knew that that's how it would end. I just kind of lucked into that.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back and touch on that digital transformation and business side, more recent business side stuff. But I guess to stay in the past for just a moment, the book in some ways can be seen as kind of a book about a succession of executive editors of the paper and their relationship with the publisher with whom they work, but also with the newsroom. And I guess in a sense with wider society, the society the Times reaches out into with its journalism. And this is probably a cheeky question, maybe like asking you to pick your favorite child. So feel free to fudge the answer, I guess. But was there one who either you think was particularly important to the story of the Times across the period that you're writing about, or just one of the editors who you felt was particularly fun or engaging to write about?
Yeah, I don't think it's a cheeky question at all. I think it's a great question, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a politician's answer to it, because different ones were interesting for different reasons. I know I sound like Bill Clinton, but so for example, like Abe Rosenthal, the first one, is a really interesting character. He is, on one hand, the last of a type. I would argue a really good journalist with fine credentials and really good news sense, and to a large extent a dedication to the Times, but also very flawed. And I don't think that he could. I wouldn't even qualify it. He could not survive this era, given the way he acted, the way he treated people, his views towards women, towards gay people, towards people of color. He just would not survive. But he's a great, big, colorful figure, and I think he's great that way. I think that Dean Baquet, the most recent editor, is really interesting because he was ultimately the transitional editor. He was, I think, 57 when we became executive editor, and he was, in my opinion, smart enough to, if he didn't quite understand what people were talking about wanting to do digitally, he said, let's just do it. He was very experimental. So he was really interesting that way. Sorry, I'm not going to give you all 7 of them. But, and then I thought Joe Lelyveld was, and this will sound counterintuitive to some people who might have worked at the Times, was a really interesting example because he was really the last of an era. He was like the last one who I think was, he might quarrel with us now, but resisting the advent of digital. And it was pretty clear, I would argue, that's where the paper was going. But he was old school, and he was a brilliant journalist, and he put out a really good paper. He was also, the other thing he was resisting was the change in standards of, remember, this is Monica Lewinsky, and what kind of stuff do you put in the paper? And he was sort of navigating that, and that was a very difficult time, and I think that he was a really interesting figure that way.
Yeah. And am I right in saying that you spoke with all of the executive editors you cover in the book, with the exception of Rosenthal, who I think passed away in 2006?
That's correct.
Is that right?
I spoke to all of them.
Yeah.
Rosenthal also, I was helped by the fact, different world, right? He did extensive oral histories, and he had more files, and both his personal archives and the paper archives to draw on, and he was very emotive, I guess. Is that a fair word to use? So there was a lot of stuff, but he was the one person I didn't talk to. I spent hours with all the executive editors. They were incredibly generous with their time and letting me just come back again and again and talk to them.
Yeah. You mentioned that they were generous with their time. You also mentioned, that the sources you spoke with, on the whole, were very candid. I was sort of wondering how those conversations went, particularly with those executive editors, because you were, I don't want to say you were passing judgment on their tenure as a critic necessarily, but obviously your account does offer, strengths and weaknesses of their respective leaderships. You also, in some cases more than others, I think it's fair to say, get into quite personal spats and dramas that they had behind the scenes, sometimes with each other, but also, with other colleagues of theirs. So, what was it like sort of trying to prize those stories, out of people who, while it was in the past, I'm sure still have very strong views about what happened and their place in it? I
mean, time helps, right? So not completely, I'll tell you why in a second, but as you get more recent executive editors, I think it was more difficult for them to relive painful passages. Someone like Howell Raines, who was executive editor from, I think, 2000 to 2003, I think, and that was before he was fired, I think that was a really traumatizing period of his life. I think that there was enough distance that he was able to talk about it, mostly with some dispatch. But it's hard. And, I was very, very aware when I was talking to all of them that I was in the position that you, I think, accurately described, that, here I am coming along as someone writing about their tenure, writing about their life, that obviously the ambition of this book was to be as comprehensive about the New York Times during this period as possible. So I was very open-minded, and also, when going into sensitive stuff, very sympathetic that some of this stuff was very difficult. And, some of it was really searing. I hope that on all of them I provide, because none of them are good or bad, but I hope with all of them I provide a really balanced look at their lives and careers. But to your point, I was very aware and very sensitive about how difficult and uncomfortable this could be for some of them. Yeah.
Beyond the personalities of the executive editors, one sort of interesting strand that I saw running through the book was, kind of this changing, I don't necessarily want to say role, but changing sources of power and legitimacy, I guess, for the executive editor over time, from very much coming from that individual's relationship with the publisher to being much more dependent on, the competence of the newsroom. Obviously, you see Howell Raines, for example, really forced out because of the newsroom's negative reaction to his management style and handling of a series of controversies under his tenure. And then I think also you mentioned how in the internet age, any editor of any publication has some of their kind of agenda-setting power stripped away because the internet is this vast hubbub of noise and different news sources. I guess, how do you sort of see that role of executive editor as having changed over time from, where you start the book to where you leave off?
I don't know whether I would have known or been able to answer this question when I first started this process. I completely think I can and understand what you're asking now. There's been, in so many ways, a huge change in what it means to be executive editor of the New York Times. Let's just take one example, right? This sort of more vocal newsroom, right? It really began under Max Frankel in the 80s, right? I don't think that Abe Rosenthal would have put up with reporters challenging him as openly as reporters did to Max Frankel when the newspaper published the name of a woman accuser in a rape case involving the Kennedy, the nephew of Ted Kennedy. I think the nephew, as I recall. And you could see the newsroom becoming more, I'm going to use the word empowered, more vocal, and that just became more and more the case. And I think the executive editors had to be more conscious of it. I don't think that that Howell Raines was, and I think the story of Howell Raines, those chapters, really describe sort of, again, whatever brilliance he had as a news guy, right, the sort of breakdown of his position because he had antagonized the newsroom so much. And I think that if you want to be, in the old days, if you want to be a great executive editor, you had to put out a great report, right? But you also have to get along with the publisher, right? Those are the two main things. But now it's a much more complicated and in some ways maybe less powerful job, right? Because you have to get along with the publisher. You have to get along with a more and more vocal newsroom. You have to get along with this clamorous world that's the internet. You have to get along with the fact that you're being fly-specked on everything you did. So it's a much different job. And on one hand, as you suggest, it's a less powerful job. On the other hand, it's probably a much more difficult job. Again, I don't think Abe Rosenthal would last 6 months in the job today, and that has nothing to do with his abilities as a journalist, purely because of his personality.
Yeah. As is usually the case with history, I guess, there is that kind of story of that evolution, and obviously other things evolve over time at the paper. But there's also some continuity in there as well, and I guess I kept being struck by little nuggets jumping out at me that really seemed to reflect stories that you see about the Times today, or really just about the world of journalism today. You know that covering Richard Nixon's White House, sort of required a reinvention almost of political reporting, or at least a reconsideration of the old rules, because they were so dishonest about a lot of what they were doing. Clearly, that put me in mind of Donald Trump and how he has kind of challenged the norms of political journalism. You mentioned sort of generational fractures in the Times' newsroom quite a long time ago that seem to echo, reporting that comes out of the paper now about splits between older or younger or different groups of staffers. Were you sort of surprised to see some of those historical echoes when you were going through it? Was it something you kind of expected? How do you sort of find those, I guess?
No, I did not expect it, to tell you the truth. I wasn't around then. So again, let's use the example of Frankel and publishing the name of the woman who accused the man of rape. The newsroom just exploded. I mean, they had meetings, and you actually saw some cases where reporters were talking to reporters from other organizations. Now, if I say that to you, you're like, well, of course. But at the time, that was unthinkable, right? Like, people under the Abe Rosenthal era would have been afraid to lose their jobs, I think. So you see hints of it early on. And I guess one of the subtexts of this history is the rising authority and vocalness of the newsroom. We can debate whether that's a good thing or not, but it is a thing, and it's something that very much defines the New York Times. And I think that's what's going on now, is you're trying to sort of manage how much role the newsroom and various reporters have and how it does the report. But that's been a constant theme all along, no question about it.
Yeah. I do want to get onto, a couple of more specific stories that were controversial or that, play an important part in your book. But just sort of to finish with this idea of the power of the editor and the dynamic between them and the newsroom. It does sort of seem to me like you have this procession of editors who are not exactly, but sort of roughly by turns, quite radical in ways they want to change the paper, quite thrusting and bold and daring, but in ways that, threaten to get away from them. They sort of overreach and cause themselves problems. And then sometimes after that, you see editors coming in who are a much steadier hand, perceived as the kind of safe choice, you're very well respected in the newsroom, maybe better managers, but who perhaps don't reach far enough, are perceived as not going far enough to keep the Times up with the Times, as it were. Was that a dynamic that you also sort of thought about when you were writing this kind of dialectic almost between different editors dragging the paper forward, but with problems? So then you sort of have to take a step back. How do you sort of assess that dynamic, I guess?
I mean, I think that is what's going on. Let's do two examples. One is when Max Frankel took over, he immediately said he was going to be the not Abe, right? Not Abe Rosenthal. So everything that Rosenthal did, he wasn't going to do. So he started socializing with reporters. He showed up at a baseball game and barbecue at a reporter's house on the Upper West Side, and reporters were sitting there talking and thinking, like, that would never happen again, right? 20 years later, I guess, or 10 years later, after Howell Raines is forced out, Bill Keller comes along. He's a much more mild-mannered editor, and I think he was making a point of being less sort of divisive. Now, the other side of that, right, is that maybe, at least initially, those editors weren't as aggressive as, say, a Max Frankel or an Abe Rosenthal. But this whole thing is about going one way, going the other, just trying to find the right sort of tone for the newsroom and the paper. And I guess it's not surprising that, an editor would come along, would really push the envelope, and Howell Raines was certainly one of those editors, and that maybe go too far and that the next person would come back and pull it back a little bit. So you have to look at this thing, so I cover 7 executive editors. Obviously, you have to look at the continuum of how the paper changed and didn't change over those 7 terms, right? But it's at the same time, they're all different chapters, but they all, in the end, are one sort of big chapter of the New York Times, the modern-day New York Times.
Yeah. You described the paper at one point as a muscle-bound company that held on to its dedication to tradition at the cost of being slow to change. I think you do sort of use the words institutionally conservative at one point to describe the Times. And I guess that was something that sort of jumped out at me from a lot of the stories that you tell, that it is a paper that does change a lot over the course of the period that you've written about, but often has to kind of follow the example of other news organizations and the example of adapting to the internet, or in some other ways be dragged kicking and screaming a little bit. And obviously one area where that institutional conservatism is particularly acute that you write about is, in the Times is in both internal diversity within the newsroom and then also, coverage of different communities. You write, for example, about woeful shortcomings in the paper's coverage of the AIDS crisis, for example. Could you just sort of talk a little bit about that kind of dynamic within the newsroom, and how the Times sort of did fail in so many different chapters of your book when it came to that goal of diversifying the newsroom?
Yeah, I mean, the paper was essentially a conservative, small c, resistant to change organization. I think that has clearly changed over the past 8 years, but that was very much the case. And those are two separate examples. Let me take both. You could see it in terms of the diversity in the newsroom. As early as 1969, I found the last publisher at the time, Punch Sulzberger, complaining about the fact that the newsroom was so overwhelmingly white and saying, I want to do something about this. And you read his message to the editors, this speech he gave, as I recall, and I believe him. I think he really believed it, right? That was what he, believed in. But it didn't make a difference. The paper's sort of progress in sort of diversifying the newsroom was really slow over decades, right? Max Frankel comes in and he's like, okay, he institutes a 1-for-1 policy where for every one white journalist hired, there'd be a person of color hired, right? And after 6 months, he was really frustrated because it just wasn't happening. And he was coming up against the resistance of these people, the editors who would say like, we don't want to make decisions based on that. We want to make decisions based on who we think the best journalists are. I'm putting that in air quotes because that's obviously a contentious kind of way to look at the world. So it took a really long time. And I think that goes to the nature of the paper and also nature of society. I think on some things, the Times wasn't afraid to be second, not on big news stories necessarily, but on that kind of stuff. I need to just add to that I think that the culture has changed dramatically there over the past 5 or 6 years. But that was absolutely the case for a long time. And, I think you could blame society, you could blame the conservatism of the Times, you could blame elitism, right, which was very much defining the Times in those early years. The AIDS thing is a slightly different example, which I'm happy to talk about. I think it has to go very much with the fact that a lot of people, epitomized by Abe Rosenthal, were kind of threatened and uncomfortable with the homosexuality even before the AIDS epidemic came along in 1980, 1981. And as a result, the paper was, and I don't think anyone would quarrel with this now, woefully slow in writing about this calamity that was taking place in its own backyard. Remember that, like, New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles, to a lesser extent, were the cities where this was really hitting hard. And it was, I think, 2 years from when the Times first wrote the story about this mysterious epidemic, I almost said pandemic, epidemic that was breaking out mainly among homosexuals and intravenous drug users. I think that they knew that at the time, before it became a front page story. And, one thing Max Frankel did when he came in was say that we're going to change this, and he basically said something to the effect of, we're not going to be on the wrong side of history here, and he signed a bunch of people to write about it. Now, Roosevelt's an interesting guy here. He when he came back from overseas, one of the first stories he assigned as the Metropolitan editor was a story about the increasing visibility of gay people on the streets of New York. But, I came across, I was going through old documents, I came across an old private diary he wrote that was over in the public library. I don't know how it ended up there. But, we talked about, people asked me, whether or not I would hire a homosexual for a prominent job. He goes, I would not hire a homosexual reporter to cover, and John, this is from my memory, which two examples, but this is basically right. The White House and the State Department, I would have them cover culture and, fashion, right? He said the reason for that is that homosexuals form cliques in the newsroom, and that's very dangerous to the sort of, spirit of the newsroom. So this was very interesting because, for years, people had speculated that Abe Rosenthal was homophobic, right? And, I guess you could say people thought that, you could judge him by the way he directed the coverage. But when you find this private diary, when he's talking about it, he's saying in his own words, and I think it helps you understand the paper's real slowness and timidity in covering, this huge crisis that swept across the country in the early 1980s.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm one of those tedious people who has a social science degree, and political scientists talk about actors and institutions and, which are more determinative in sort of shaping political change. And obviously, just to a large extent, the answer is usually both. But sort of interested, in those moments where the Times has been sort of institutionally conservative, whether you think it's kind of preponderantly because of the attitudes of the people in charge, as you were just sort of mentioning in the example of AIDS coverage and those related things, or whether there is something, about the Times as an institution that has kind of contributed to a sense of, inertia or stasis or being difficult to, turn on a dime. A sense comes across, I guess, reading your book that you could almost compare it to a big ship, right? It's huge right. And obviously has a kind of very prominent role both within the journalism world and society. And it's obviously, with a very big ship, that is something that doesn't necessarily have a very adroit turning circle. So I guess I'm just curious if you sort of think there is something about the Times as an institution that has, contributed to that dynamic rather than just it being a result of the people in charge.
I do. I think I might even use a phrase comparing it to a ship. It's very slow and it's very hard to turn around. But part of it is also its self-regard, and I'm not putting that in a kind of, I'm not putting it down, just what it is, right? It views itself as sort of this, or did, not so much anymore, as this arbiter of society, an arbiter of journalistic norms, of societal norms, and, as you know, the sort of DNA of a newspaper is you want to be first on stuff, right? You want to break the story first, whatever it is, right? But I think on some stuff it was comfortable not being first. I think it was comfortable not being first on AIDS coverage or on some diversity coverage, and part of that is because it had this sort of, rarefied view of itself and its role in society. And I think you're right, part of it has to do with the people who were there, but the other part of it was just the way it viewed itself. And other organizations, you could see this through all kinds of stuff, including the transformation to digital. Other organizations moved comparatively a lot more quickly. And that is just because the Times is a big conservative, again, small c, organization that I think was wary of change or change too fast. Now, one thing I discovered, which I didn't know coming into the book, is I don't want to say it was completely change resistant, right? Like one of the earliest things we talk about is how in the 1970s, when the paper was facing, an economic calamity is too strong a word, but problems, right? People were moving to the suburbs from New York City. Advertising was off the cliff. They began to create this sort of food section and culture section and all these sections that we all kind of know today. That was kind of a big thing for the Times. I mean, the Times liked the idea of being these two, 8-column, really gray, boring newspaper. And so all of a sudden, there was a front page of the dining or food section, whichever it was called at the time, with a big picture of a pickle across the top, right? And I think that it says something about Arthur Sulzberger Sr., Punch Sulzberger, that he was willing to do that. I mean, Abe Rosenthal resisted that because it was this is going across against the standards of what he sees as the New York Times. But I think you could see in his memos, he began to realize that he needed to do this just to survive with the publisher. And after it was all done, the publisher was like, I love this stuff. I don't know why we didn't do it sooner. The lesson here is, because looking back now, John, those aren't, those don't seem like the biggest changes in the world, but it does show that the paper at least had some ability to change, but certainly not as much as any other kind of, major newspaper or organization in this country.
Yeah. And just quickly, unlike the hulking ship of the New York Times, your ship metaphor obviously sailed into my head so elegantly that I thought it was my own idea. So apologies for
No, it's fine.
plagiarized.
It's funny. I can't recall whether I left that illusion in the book or not, but that idea is certainly there. So either way, that's great.
Well,
it's perfect.
It sailed across very clearly. And I mentioned tortured ship puns aside, that I wanted to sort of move over to some of these individual stories and episodes that were really markers of the Times' history as you tell it in the book. On the sort of editorial side. And two of those that you dedicate a lot of space to that are super interesting, of course, were the Jason Blair plagiarism and falsification scandal, and obviously also the coverage of the war in Iraq, which, in places was overly credulous and sort of boosterish of the administration's case for war. And I think you note that Arthur Sulzberger, the publisher at the time, later said that, of that period when those two scandals, I guess, were roughly contemporaneous, it was the Blair one that hurt the paper more reputationally. But you seem to disagree with that and think it was probably the Iraq scandal that either did the most damage or revealed the kind of bigger flaw at the Times, unless I'm reading you wrongly. But could you sort of talk about?
You're writing me. You're reading me correctly. I gave that a lot of thought. I mean, maybe this is an argument I shouldn't engage, but I think I disagree with the publisher about that. Like, Jason Blair was enormously damaging. Just for viewers who might not know, he was a reporter who came along and he just invented stories out of whole cloth for whatever. It's in the book. You can read about why he had substance problems and just. I mean, it just invented stories out of all cloth. And when they started investigating him and began looking at his work, they realized that there were tons of them, right? And it was, I think it was pathological. It just was. And it showed, the paper, always kind of assumed you could trust your reporters. And I think our readers, the paper's readers, always assumed that they could trust the newspaper. So that's what I think Arthur Sulzberger Jr. is talking about when he talks about how damaging it was. And I do think it took years for the Times to get past that. I mean, there was a long time when you would turn on David Letterman, the talk show host here, and they would be making jokes about Jason Blair. Or if you were out reporting a story and somebody wanted to discredit you, they would say, you're just another Jason Blair. The thing about the war is that I think the stakes were higher, right? And I think that has fed a long-term mistrust. I don't want to overstate this, right? Because obviously I think people tend to trust the Times and stuff, but mistrust of the Times on the extent to which they're going to, carry or repeat the administration line. I mean, some of those stories were exactly as you said. They were either wrong or just too boosterish, and for whatever reason. And I think that still is coloring the way a lot of people see the Times today. I mean, the fact of the matter is, the Times, in the early, I think if you had Punch Sulzberger here, well, you wouldn't be alive, neither would I, but he would not completely quarrel with the idea of the Times almost being, I don't want to overstate this, part of the government or near, you know what I mean? They were sort of part of the same, what we used to call growing up, the establishment. And I think that's probably not a good thing. And I think the Washington Post sort of began to break that with its Watergate coverage. I think now the media has generally really broken that. But the Iraq coverage, which seemed to promote what turned out to be, if not untruths, distortions about the war that was being pushed by the George Bush 43 administration, I think really damaged the paper. And I think that we still, to some extent, pay a price for that. Even though, the paper changed. The reporter who was at the center of that, Judy Miller, left the paper. I think the paper is much more scrupulous in terms of reporting those kind of stories. But I don't know. I think that was kind of a big deal. I mean, I spent a lot of time on that in the book. I spent a lot of time on Jason Blair in the book because I think they're both really big events, right? But if you ask me, I think that ultimately Iraq was more damaging.
Yeah, I think as you say, Jason Blair looks like a really huge, damning, basic failure. But at some level, when you're working in even an institution as big and powerful as the New York Times, relationships do, I guess, have to be based on trust. And if someone just completely, refuses to accept that kind of basic compact, then to some level, they'll probably always be able to perpetuate some kind of wrongdoing. Whereas I think you make the case that the failures that led up to the Iraq War were more routine and more, within the paper's kind of organizational principles and structures than a sort of, freak one-off attack coming from someone well outside them, if that makes sense.
That makes sense, and also much more damaging, right? The repercussions of the war in Iraq, right? However much you want to make the Times part of why it happened, are huge. I talked to one editor who was responsible for disciplining Jason Blair, and he said, he says, we had this manual, right? We have all these rules and stuff, but we have no rules against somebody making stuff. He didn't use the word stuff, but you can guess what I mean. Against somebody making stuff up. And I sat there and I thought, yeah, like at that point, I think it was so, obviously you had Janet Cook, but I think it was so out of the range of possibilities, everyone was kind of shocked by it. And that to some extent is oversimplifying. I think that Jason was a very aggressive reporter, and he was good at doing what editors liked, and he was hungry, and he was always, not always, but often on the phone and willing to do stuff. That fed into it as well. But, ultimately, I think if you're an editor on the desk and it's 9 o'clock at night, these are back when you had print deadlines, and you're looking at a story and a quote seems like a little bit too good to be true, well, at that point, you wouldn't think that it is good to be true. You'd think, hey, this reporter is reporting from Midland, Texas, and he says he's there, and he's quoting the family, so of course it's true. Well, I don't think that would happen today. But again, there was something about the Jason Blair thing that seemed more individual than systematic. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that was what I was getting at.
Okay.
Of course, to some extent, they're both. Just a final question on the Iraq War front, because while you do clearly show that some of the coverage, as you say, was wrong or boosterish or both, you do take a sort of nuanced position around what that coverage was like. As someone who wasn't following the New York Times' coverage at the time, because I was 11, I think, and in England, probably didn't know what the New York Times was. But I was interested to read, as someone who sort of looked back on that coverage but wasn't reading it at the time, that initially Howell Raines, who had previously been the editorial page editor and was the executive editor by then, he was actually facing accusations of kind of being, too anti-intervention. I guess the insinuation there, given the sort of heightened security climate after 9/11, was he was being unpatriotic. I guess, talk about some of those sort of nuances in how you found that coverage going back to look at it. Because I guess among many critics, the sort of ossified, simplified narrative now is that the coverage was kind of one big pro-Bush administration failure. But you paint a richer picture.
Yeah, I think you make a really important point here, which is the context of the time, right? We'll come back to Howell Raines in a second. That's also a good point. But this is after September 11th, and there was a expectation, right, that everyone was patriotic and we're all on the same side, and we're not going to do anything to damage the country, damage our national security. Our country had been attacked, right? So I think that was very much in the head of everyone in the New York Times, and I think that probably influenced coverage for 3 or 4, maybe 5 years. You can really kind of track it before the paper, and all papers, I don't think it's just true of the New York Times, sort of got its bearings right. This was difficult, right? This was really challenging. And I guess from the paper's perspective, even though other people didn't get this right, why would the administration lie about the threat of WMD, of weapons of mass destruction, that could once again put the U.S. at risk? So you're putting yourself in Howell Raines' position, I kind of get it, right? I hope I provided a nuanced account of this, because it's a human drama involving humans, editors and publishers and reporters who are just trying to figure out a very difficult and scary time. Without making it too personal for him, he lived down in the West Village, right? He lived on 10th or 11th Street. That's like a mile, maybe a mile and a half away from where those buildings collapsed, right? The 2 World Trade Center buildings. When he left his office, he left his apartment that morning, he looked back over his shoulder as he jumped into a cab, and he could see, I was living down there too, so I remember what it looked like. The smoke in the air and the helicopters, and just it was ungraspable, the horror. It was just really, you're not really trained to understand what was going on. So I think that's an important perspective for him. the other thing, and this is kind of a different issue, but, Howell Raines, as you said, came from being the editorial page editor to become the executive editor, as did Max Frankel. Like, I always thought there was a little bit of I don't think that should be disqualifying, but that's complicated because you have spent the past, 6 or 8 years giving your opinions, and all of a sudden you're supposed to come in and, run a news department without giving your opinions, right? Or not even having opinions that you're sharing. And I think that that's a difficult adjustment. And, Howell Raines' editorials, which you write about in the book a lot, he was a hell of a writer, and he could write really powerfully, and he wrote really, really evocative editorials. I mean, go back and look at his editorial about Robert McNamara having lied about the war in Vietnam. I mean, it was just, the words will just stick with you forever. So you can understand where a reader, or someone who buys or follows the New York Times would say, hey, this guy who had such strong opinions running the editorial page is all of a sudden running the news department. Why should we not think that's influencing the way he's running the news department? That's a fair question. I mean, I think it's one of the things that you think about. But again, there's a history of editorial page editors who work really close with the publisher, becoming executive editors as well.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask about that, but just to follow up on the previous point very quickly, do you think that in that kind of coverage of Iraq that did turn out to be credulous and boosterish, that there was any sense of a sort of overreaction on overcorrection, I should say, on Howell Raines' part to the perception that he was, I guess, squishy in the eyes of neocon pundits?
I do think the answer to that is yes. I was just pausing because I was trying to think how he would argue if he was here. I do think the answer was yes, and I'm trying to put myself, and I did in the book, into the reality of the situation he was dealing with at the time. And, initially, this is all sketched out here, right? Like, the paper had written some very tough, skeptical stories about Iraq, and it had been attacked by, among others, Dick Cheney, who was the vice president at the time. There was a lot of incoming coming in, and a lot of people that were sort of accusing the paper of being biased the other way. And do I think that influenced, to some extent, Howell Raines' thinking and some of the other people's thinking and how to approach the coverage? Yeah, I think that's pretty clear when you read the book and you look at it. I keep thinking, like, what would I do in this situation? It was a scary, difficult time. But clearly, they went too far in the other direction, and they were too believing of some of the stories, not all the stories, but some of the stories that Judy Miller was writing out of Iraq and out of Washington, D.C.
Yeah. To go back to that sort of strange divide you mentioned between the newsroom and the editorial pages, just kind of more broadly. I mean, the Times and journalists who work there have sometimes very frustratedly been keen to make the point on social media in the past that, the opinion writers don't represent the newsroom and vice versa, that there is some kind of firewall there. But the reality has always struck me as a bit more complicated. And it was very interesting to read in the book that, the editorial pages were kind of seen as training wheels almost for the top job in the entire newsroom on more than one occasion. How do you sort of approach that? Because on the one hand, I guess showing that you are capable of running a whole sort of mini fiefdom within the paper before running the whole thing makes sense on a kind of managerial level, but it does expose your views pretty widely, as you just mentioned. So, I guess, to what extent was your view of that sort of divide between the news and opinion sections changed, or how did it evolve while you were writing the book and doing the research? So,
if you had asked me this before I wrote the book, I don't think I could answer that question. This is one of the things I sort of figured out as I was watching it go on. The newsroom there's always been this wall, and you're right, it's porous, but this wall between the newsroom and the editorial page, and the editorial page is on a different floor, and reporters are a little bit wary about socializing with members of the board or the head of the editorial page, but there's always some interaction, right? And like the columnists and the editorial writers and the head of the editorial page obviously want to be able to draw on reporters to understand stuff and to write informed editorial. So it's kind of complicated, but you'll find reporters who are often very wary. I'll tell you one anecdote that was not in the book, though frankly you made me think of it. If I had thought of it, I would have put it in the book. Bill Safire, remember him? He was a big deal conservative columnist at the Times, and when the New York Times was covering the convention in if I told you which convention it was, I would be lying to you because I've been to so many I forget. But it was a convention. And you had this morning meeting of all the editorial staff, all the newsroom staff. And Bill Sapphire showed up one morning, right, at this meeting. And one of the reporters there, David Rosenbaum, raises his hand and says, Bill Sapphire should not be here. He's a member of the editorial board, a columnist of the New York Times. This is a news meeting. There's a line between these two sections and he should go. And Bill left, right? I always thought that was very, very sort of revealing, right? But the other part of this, as you pointed out, right, when Arthur Sulzberger Jr. asked Howell Raines to become his editorial page editor, Raines at first resisted because he's a newsroom guy. Like, I think he didn't even read the editorials that closely, and he wanted to run the newsroom. But as he talked to Arthur and he thought about it, he realized when you're the editorial page, you're dealing with the publisher multiple times a week, right? You're consulting with him on editorials. You're inviting him to these big lunches and dinners with these, big newsmakers who are coming in, presidents and stuff. So you have a lot of interaction with the publisher, and it's the publisher who decides who the next executive editor is going to be. So in the sort of, I don't mean this to sound crass because it's just the way the world works, but that is just a really good way to position yourself to become the next executive editor. And I think taking nothing away from Howell Raines' journalistic credentials or his credentials as the editorial page editor, and same with Max Frankel, the same thing happened. I think they were both very, very aware of that. And I think that's one of the reasons they became executive editors, because the publishers at the time were able to observe them close up and decide, do we want this person for this job? So it's complicated. Yeah. And also, I need to talk away. And the lines these days over the years have sort of dropped a little bit between what's editorial and what's a news story, and reporters are encouraged more to have a point of view, not an opinion. You know the difference. What I mean by that, a point of view in a story. Stories have more edges. It's harder to sort of distinguish between what's on the news pages and what's on the editorial pages. And you can see various papers try to deal with that and how they package or present the stories and the editorials and the columns on their websites or on their newspapers.
Yeah. And of course, the advent of the internet has kind of disaggregated the newspaper as a product, and an opinion and news content and everything in between sort of floats atomized on the web, which leads as a not at all contrived segue into the next question I was going to ask, which was about the internet. And you mentioned at the beginning, of course, the Times has become this incredible digital success story. It's a global multi-platform empire with The Athletic and Wordle and crosswords and cooking and a world-class app. But your book really details.
Don't forget Wirecutter. Sorry.
Yeah, and that as well. And it's certainly not an exhaustive list on my part. But your book really details how that there were teething troubles on the way to that digital future. How it was not really the case that the Times was the kind of mobile startup-ish pioneer in this space. That it was a process to get there. Right. I mean, it took a long time. I mean, there's a couple of different things that happened. One was the implementation of a paywall, right? The paper tried it twice. And I think a point was reached when Arthur Sulzberger Jr. realized the paper's not going to survive unless it gets a sort of regular source of revenue. And what had just happened, there had been another economic downturn, and he walked into the office of Martin Nietzenholz, who was the head of the digital operation, and said, I have to talk to you about this. If there's another turn down like this, I'm going to have to lay off a third of the newsroom, and I don't want to have to keep doing that every time there's a shift in the economic cycles of the country, right? We need to think about different ways to raise money, which means we need to start charging for content. And as you probably know, there was a long resistance in the digital world. Information should be free, right, to charging for this. But I think they realized that was the thing to do. And it took years to get it right. The first time they did it, it didn't work. They had to kind of abandon it. But the second time it did work, and I think that they were stunned when they implemented the paywall and began charging. It was a little bit more than a nominal fee. It was a real fee for people to get access to a decent amount of content. They were stunned by how many people began signing up right away. And I think, what are we up to now? 10 million subscribers? I don't think they ever would have expected that. The change in the
I use the word product advisedly because it seems not fitting for a news organization, but the change in the product has taken time. And I think, other organizations were ahead of the paper, the Times at times, but I think the Times is really, in terms of the way it presents news, visually, orally, interactively, the different kinds of services, it's just been a stunning change. And I wonder, were Abe Rosenthal alive today, if he was to look at the NewYorkTimes.com product, the app, would he even begin to recognize what it was from what he remembers from 40 years ago? It's been a huge transformation. And, excuse me, in a weird way, as it was going on, it's slow, right? There's stops and starts, and it runs up against the institutional conservatism. And, you'll see in the book there's editors early on saying this is ridiculous. We don't think this is ever going to happen. Why are we wasting our time on this? But it feels inevitable. And it's not, by the way, it's not only generational. It's not only younger people who come into the newsroom. It's also some really smart people who looked at the future and realized where things were going. And I think realized how exciting a digital New York Times could be, or just say, I don't want to say the New York Times, a digital news organization could be, and saw the way things were going. And the paper put money into it and resources into it. You can see it, every day.
Yeah. And some of my favorite scenes in the book were very much, the sort of stuffy old newsroom side to stereotype, and their interactions with the kind of younger digital renegades, I think was one of the words you used for them.
Yeah.
You write of Dean Baquet's editorship, something I found interesting, which was saying that the newspaper would go through a storm of change and experimentation as it tried to distinguish what it did in the name of habit and tradition from the essential values that define the Times. And that was a quote that really jumped out to me because I've heard Dean Baquet sort of talk about that before, but in the context of kind of editorial philosophy and objectivity, trying to work out what is, I think in his words, core and what is
right.
And what is something we're just doing and maybe we can do it better. So the unbelievably difficult question for you out of that is, I guess after literally writing the book on the New York Times, what do you sort of see as core New York Times values? What is the sort of core identity of the paper? That sort of holds all the way through the story you're telling, even though so much of what passed for tradition and habit and just what the Times was kind of doing, fell by the wayside and the paper transformed itself.
I think what the core is and will continue to be and probably should be is just writing or presenting, talking about the really important events and characters and the things people need to know to understand the world around them. I sound like a advertisement or something, but I do think that's really important. That to me, that's what I think Dean Baquet was talking about. That's what the paper needs to keep doing. Now, the thing that's really important here, which I think he got, because he's a transitional editor in my opinion, right, is that you can't not try other things, even if they don't work, right? So Wordle, for example, doesn't remotely fall into that definition I just gave you, but obviously people like it, and I don't think, people could argue with me, but I don't think it violates what the Times stands for. So it's that plus Wordle. But there's other things the paper could do, that might, I can't think, I'm sure, give me a minute, I can think of one. They just don't work. They try and just don't work. Experiments that don't work, but I think as long as you remember that core that Baquet was talking about, and then experiment beyond that, that's the way forward. The other point that Baquet was making, because you definitely fixed on what I think is a critical argument here, pivotal point here, is that the stuff the paper used to do out of obligation, go cover a member. This is I'm not even sure it's a real example, but you'll see what I mean. Go cover a meeting of the zoning board. I'm not sure if the Times ever covered a zoning board, but of a city council because the city council's meeting. And I think Baquet would argue, and most people would agree, the paper doesn't have enough resources to do it, and there's no reason to do it. And people can get that kind of routine news coverage in quotes, anyplace else now. So that's the kind of thing that I think he wants to shed away. I think the paper has succeeded in shedding away. It's you ultimately have limited resources and focus them on doing the things that make the paper as great as it can be. So that would include the core stuff that I was talking to you a minute ago, but also, I would include cooking, right, which has obviously been a big success for the paper, right? I don't think that, say, for example, doing cooking in addition to that stuff in any way undercuts what the Times is about. And even taking this back 40 years, I'm not good on decades, Dave Rosenthal, who resisted initially some of these special sections, well, ultimately came to think, hey, we could do these special sections, including one on cooking, right? And it doesn't take away from the paper at all, right? It's still the New York Times. Where they did draw the line, by the way, Arthur Sulzberger, like comics, no way. I used to say, I don't want to see comics in the newspaper, which I think is now changing, by the way.
Just one final question then, which is, your book is a terrific sort of institutional history, and there are so many great characters who just jump right off the page. But you also write at one point that the stories of the players are rarely as important as the story of the organization itself. I guess, what in a nutshell for you is the story of the New York Times as an organization, or put it a different way, I guess, what does this institutional history kind of mean in the context of, the world that the New York Times inhabits, the journalistic industry that the New York Times inhabits as well? So
the reason I said that is I'm a reporter, right? I used to work at the Daily News. I like flashy, shiny object stories, right? And I think that the characters and their foibles and their victories and their personalities to some extent are really important to understanding the Times. And also I hope they really enliven the narrative here, right? But I didn't want to lose track of the fact that ultimately this book is about the New York Times. And it's about this institution that has somehow managed to go through numerous transformations and continues to be a primary source of information and, hopefully credibility. We should come back to this in 5 years for the country. And so I was trying to be very careful not to let the shiny object get in the way of the bigger story. And that ultimately, this is a story about the New York Times. I think one of the lessons of, for example, Howell Raines, again, or Jill Abramson, right? I think both brilliant journalists, right, getting pushed out, right, is that there was someone else there, right? There are layers and layers of talent, at the paper, right? And, I keep telling people, these people work at the New York Times and it kind of goes to their heads. And I keep telling, right now you're Adam Nagourney of the New York Times. When you leave the New York Times, somebody else is going to fill that spot. You are defined by where you work. And I try to keep that in mind, right? One of the things about the Times is that there's so much talent and, screwed upness there that you got to be careful not to just make this about the people, which obviously make it an interesting story, an interesting history, but also about this institution as well.
Yeah. Adam Nagourney, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Afterwards podcast. We want to make sure you know about our latest podcast, Books That Shaped America. It's a companion podcast to our 10-week television series of the same name. We've teamed up with the Library of Congress and selected 10 books from across American history that have had a major impact on our society. Each week, the C-SPAN television program will focus on one of these books and its impact. This companion podcast will give you more background on the book's authors. If you want to learn more about Books That Shaped America, go to our website, c-span.org. The podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts.